I call the members to order, and the first item on our agenda this afternoon is questions to the First Minister, and the first question, David Rees.
What assessment has the Welsh Government made of the take-up of STEM subjects in Wales?
Well, GCSE entries were up across all individual science subjects last year. That increase is encouraging, because we know that more young people will be equipped with the science skills and knowledge they need to progress to study post-16.
Well, thank you for that answer, First Minister. This week is actually British Science Week, which reminds us of the importance of science, engineering and technology to the Welsh economy. You were with me last week at the Tata Works, where again they highlighted the role they had for apprentices, and they want to take more engineering apprentices on. But there's a take-up reduction in girls taking science subjects and engineering subjects. What can you do to actually encourage more young females to take up science, take up engineering, so that they can be involved in the agenda in our economy for engineering, science and apprenticeships, graduates, to actually take us forward?
Well, we know we need to ensure that greater numbers of young women go into STEM subjects. We are working to address the actions that were identified in talented women for a successful Wales. Improved gender balance in STEM is being highlighted in work on curriculum reform in professional learning provision and through enrichment and engagement programmes. The National Networks for Excellence have also been tasked to consider gender equity, and we know teachers have a big influence on young people's study choices, so it's essential that our schools are supported to enhance girls' experiences of STEM learning.
Darren Miller.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, I was intrigued to hear your response there, because of course you didn't mention the positive contribution that the further education sector is making to encourage STEM careers and STEM learning. Will you congratulate me, for example, will you congratulate Coleg Cambria, rather, and me for raising it? Will you congratulate Coleg Cambria, for example, for the excellent work that it is doing in promoting STEM careers? It's got some fantastic work going on with its chemistry students, which are encouraging people to be ambassadors for jobs in the chemistry industry. And in addition to that, it's doing some great work with science and maths societies that host competitions and bring in speakers to enthuse young people in order to take advantage of the STEM careers that are offered in North East Wales and elsewhere. What work are you doing with the further education sector in particular to promote vocational routes into STEM careers?
Well, I will offer him congratulations if any are due. I'll also offer congratulations to Coleg Cambria, because we know that FE is hugely important, particularly when it comes to looking at apprenticeships. And we know that we need to grasp everybody in terms of the talent they have available. No talent should be allowed to go to waste. It's important as well to engage girls before they go to the FE college. So that's why it's so important to look at ways in which science teachers particularly can make sure that girls feel they are fully part of lessons. It's why we're talking to physics teachers about how they can make their lessons more gender inclusive, so that they are ready at 16 to look at science subjects in FE college and then move on to apprenticeships. But certainly I'm happy to join him in offering a word of congratulations, of course, to the work that's been done in Coleg Cambria.
Sir Griffith.
Thank you, Llywydd. Of course, one of the problems that makes this situation worse is your government's failure to recruit sufficient numbers into teacher training courses for some of these STEM subjects. The recent SYN report shows that only 3/4 of the target for maths and chemistry has been achieved in terms of attracting people to register for teacher training, 2/3 in physics, and barely half the target met in terms of those coming to teach biology. So what hope is there to inspire a new generation from the point of view of STEM subjects when we can't even recruit the teachers to teach them?
Well, it's true to say that supporting the teaching profession is vital to the changes that will be taking place in the world of education. And, of course, we do ensure that the support available at present as regards the standard of teaching science, technology and maths continues to improve in the teaching workforce. And so, yes, while we say it's important that we move on to the new curriculum, we must also ensure that there is a sufficient number of people available not only to teach through the medium of English, but sometimes it's more difficult to get people to be able to teach science through the medium of Welsh. We won't attain a target, for example, of 1 million Welsh speakers by the middle of this century unless we can also ensure that we have sufficient number of teachers in order to expand Welsh medium education.
Question 2, Mandy Jones.
Diolch, Llywydd. Will the First Minister make a statement on further devolution to Wales in light of powers that will be transferred back from Brussels following Brexit?
Well, I mean, the UK government language on further devolution on new powers is not quite accurate because those powers would come to us anyway. Our immediate priority is to protect areas which are already devolved, such as agriculture and environment, and has been well documented. We do not agree with any attempt, without agreement, to remove powers from this National Assembly as they come here from Brussels.
Thank you for that answer. First Minister, you and I both agree that the powers currently resting with the EU should come to Wales in their entirety. For this to happen, the UK and Wales must be out of the EU single market. Will you now, finally, outline your government's position? Single market membership or full control over devolved areas?
Well, I'm not sure I've been particularly silent about what the government's view is. Our view is quite simply this. We need to have full and unfettered access to the single market. There's a debate as whether you can be a member of the single market or not. What's important is that our businesses are able to access the single market in the same way as they do now. Surely we don't want to see barriers put up between ourselves and our single biggest market. So from our perspective, what we have said is that where powers would return from Brussels, they come here naturally. That's what would happen in the constitutional sense, and they shouldn't be diverted down towards Whitehall unless and until there is agreement between the governments, plural, of the UK to do so.
David Melding.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, after having so closely allied yourself with the Scottish Government, can you assure this Assembly that when you meet the Prime Minister tomorrow, you will not be deflected from seeking the most constructive option now available to Wales?
Well, as it happens, the Scottish Government and ourselves are as one on this, because the challenge we face is exactly the same. We have offered a way forward. We understand the UK Government's view that there needs to be no disruption of the UK's internal single market. We understand that. There needs to be certainty for businesses. We understand that. The difference is this. We want to create that certainty through agreement and not by imposition. And that's where we need the UK Government to be, to recognise that there is no one government in the UK that controls Brexit, but there are different governments who will be representing their different nations. And ourselves and Scotland have been in the same position, and we have jointly put forward suggestions that we think would help to create the certainty that everybody wants to see.
Steffan Lewis.
Diolch, Llywydd. Wrth gwrs, cyn ni siarad.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before we talk about new powers for Wales after leaving the European Union, there's the small issue of powers being rolled back from Wales in the meantime, something that the Westminster Government has admitted will happen. And they admitted that over the weekend. Now, we have seen the Westminster Government's amendment to Clause 11 of the bill. We know that the Westminster Government will have the right to bring new orders to the Westminster Parliament without the consent of this Assembly, which will have an impact on devolved issues, and those orders could even become part of UK-wide frameworks for the future, again, without the consent of this Parliament. And I've noticed this morning that the language of the government here in Wales has started to soften on these issues, and I would like an assurance from the First Minister that he isn't about to agree to a compromise which will have a negative impact on the Welsh Constitution.
No, that situation wouldn't be acceptable to us, and I discussed this with Nicola Sturgeon yesterday. We were both in the same place. It's not adequate that the powers should remain in the same place, and that those powers should be used in a way which is not of benefit to Scotland nor Wales. We would prefer nothing at all. We would prefer not to agree anything that would give any kind of consent or a free hand to the government in Westminster to amend secondary legislation without any kind of by a leave or permission by Wales or Scotland.
Questions now from party leaders. Leader of the Opposition, Andrew Davis.
Presiding Officer. First Minister, in relation to ambulance response times, with the new categories, the government does seem to have made progress. But we do know over the last couple of months, across the United Kingdom, ambulance response times have been under pressure. Recently, in the press, there have been examples of extreme waits that patients and people have had to wait for ambulances. I cite a gentleman in Dinas Powys who waited 16 hours to receive an ambulance. I cite an example yesterday in the South Wales Evening Post where a lady was taken to hospital after such a long wait for an ambulance and returned home, only to find the ambulance turning up 20 hours later in West Wales. And in my own region, yesterday in Cowbridge, a lady waited 10.5 hours for the ambulance to turn up on Sunday and getting admitted to A&E at 1:15 in the morning on Monday morning. I hope that you can recognise that there are these cases out there. I don't look to you to comment on those individual cases because I appreciate you can't do that. But does the government recognise that there is a real issue when it comes to certain waiting times across the whole of Wales for the Welsh Ambulance Service to respond to? And if you do recognise that, what measures are you putting in place to address those deeply distressing wait times that families, patients and indeed the paramedics and operators of the ambulance service have to deal with?
Well, I have no reason to doubt the examples that have been cited by the Leader of the Opposition, and those examples need to be investigated, of course, and investigated fully. Could I say that the ambulance response times model was devised by clinicians? It is designed to ensure that those who are most in need of an ambulance get an ambulance. We know that ambulance response times have improved greatly over the past few months, and indeed now for more than a year. But there will be examples that he has detailed which need to be looked at to see why such a situation has arisen. It is right to say that there's been a great deal of pressure on the NHS and indeed on ambulances across the UK over the past few months particularly. And of course the cold snap of last week did have an effect, particularly on missions of strokes, where there was a substantial increase in the number of people who had had strokes because of the cold weather. So what we do, of course, is to look to ensure that individual cases are looked at. When it comes to the actual model that's used, it is a model that was devised by clinicians.
I made the specific point when I opened my remarks by saying that there has been progress on ambulance response times in certain categories, but it is undeniable that week after week we are seeing cases, both in the press and reported here in the chamber, of extreme waits that are hugely distressing to the paramedics, the teams who manage the ambulance service, and importantly the patients and families who have called for the ambulances to come in their hour of need. The issue that I highlighted with you from the constituent in Cowbridge that I highlighted, actually on Monday morning at the Princess of Wales Hospital, they were actually using the bereavement room to stack trolleys with patients on because the pressure in A&E was so great. Now, we highlighted to you over the weekend that over the last 3 years, the equivalent of 1,000 nurses have been lost to the Welsh NHS from FOI information that we've received from the local health boards. If you haven't got the staff on the front line, how on earth are you able to deal with the patients coming through the front door and the increased demand on the NHS so that ultimately the 999 service can respond instead of being parked in car parks around the country?
Well, I can say to the Leader of the Opposition that more registered nurses are working in the NHS than ever before. For example, since 2014, the number of nurse training places commissioned has risen by 68%. That, alongside our international recruitment campaign, demonstrates our commitment to ensuring the NHS continues to have a high-quality workforce. We are aware of cases where nurses have left the profession. The reasons around that are varied and complex. Numbers will fluctuate year on year, but we know that, as I said, there are more registered nurses than ever. We are investing this year £107 million in education and training programmes for healthcare professionals. That has resulted in a 10% increase in commissioned nurse training places over the course of the last year. So the nurses are there, but I think we have to understand that, of course, when it comes to A&E admissions are affected indirectly by delayed transfers of care, for example, where people are unable to leave a hospital when they are ready to do so and therefore able to I put it in a way that's perhaps harsh, vacate a bed, then that of course means that pressure is relieved all the way through the system to the very front of the hospital in A&E. So it is hugely important to recruit healthcare professionals. I've illustrated how we're planning to do that, but also of course to focus on moving people through the hospital when they're ready and out of hospital when they're ready in order to make sure there's space available for others who need those beds.
My first question highlighted the dilemma, the crisis that some people do face when they ring for an ambulance here in Wales. And that was my very point. The system isn't allowing the flow of patients, so that instead of being parked in hospital car parks with patients on, the ambulances are out in the community dealing with the 999 calls that are requesting their help. I've highlighted that from FOI requests from the LHBs, these are their own figures, that 1,000 nurses have been lost to the NHS here in Wales through not being able to retain the nurses within our service. The health board that is under your direct control, Betsy Cadwaladr, has lost 493 nurses in that period. They are the highest number of nurses not being replaced out of all the 7 health boards here in Wales. It's not unreasonable, First Minister, to put to you that, and has been put to me over the last couple of days, in particular by this family from Cowbridge, has the Welsh Labour Government run out of ideas when it comes to addressing the pressure points within our NHS? So can you give me something to go back to my constituents and many other people in Wales to understand what exactly is the timeline for seeing progress in the Welsh NHS so that these 10, 12, 14, 16-hour waits are not a regular occurrence within our ambulance service?
Well, if we look at the figures, we see that ambulance response times have improved, and he's acknowledged that. We see improvements in delayed transfer of care, we see improvements in terms of diagnostics, we see improvements in terms of referral to treatment times, but there will be occasions where some people are affected adversely. And they need to be looked at very carefully and investigated, and lessons learned from those occasions. I have to say that the financial pressures on the NHS are always considerable, and they are financial pressures that exist across the whole of the UK. And we have to make sure that there is sufficient funding available for the Welsh NHS. And we're in a position where fairly soon the NHS will consume half of our resources. And we have to, as political parties, I believe we have to look very carefully, and the Parliamentary Review, in fairness, has done this, as to how we allocate resources to the NHS in the future, how we remove logjams, if there are any, and how we develop an NHS that commands public support across political parties.
Arweinydd Grŵp UK.
Leader of the UKIP Group, Neil Hamilton.
All members will have been horrified by the recent nerve agent attack in Salisbury. The general consensus of opinion appears to be that the exchange in the House of Commons yesterday by Jeremy Corbyn and the Prime Minister fell well below the level of events. Chris Leslie, a former Labour Shadow Chancellor, said it wasn't appropriate to make party political points when our country is potentially under attack. Another Labour MP, John Woodcock, said it would put our national security at significant risk if we were led by anyone who didn't understand the gravity of the threat which Russia poses to this nation. Does the First Minister think that Jeremy Corbyn is such a person?
Well, I'm not here to answer for anybody else anymore. I'm sure he's not here to explain how it is that Nigel Farage thinks that a trade deal with the US is possible in 48 hours, which is what he said yesterday. This is a hugely serious matter. We have people who have been badly affected. We have a police officer who was badly affected. Fortunately, it seems on the road to recovery. Of course, there needs to be a full investigation, and the investigating authorities will have the support, I'm sure, of politicians, not just in Westminster, but of politicians of all sides here in this chamber.
I noticed that the First Minister sidestepped the question, but Nicola Sturgeon has said cool heads are certainly required, but also a firm response. Russia simply can't be allowed to launch attacks on our streets with impunity. Does the First Minister agree with that?
Of course I agree with that. I mean, I don't know what he's trying here to suggest that in some way I do not accept there has to be a full investigation, or do not accept there's any Russian involvement. Of course those factors come into play. But it's hugely important that there is a full investigation. I know that on a non-partisan basis there is support for that both in the House of Commons and indeed I'm sure here in the Assembly. It cannot be right that people are injured or worse as a result of the use of what appears to be a military-grade nerve agent. Whoever was responsible for that needs to be brought to justice.
Well, I thank the First Minister for that very reasonable reply. One thing that I did agree with Jeremy Corbyn on as a result of yesterday's exchange was this. He said there must be a robust dialogue with Russia on all issues dividing our countries, both domestic and international, rather than simply cutting off contact. If that is true of Russia, it is perhaps even more true of our relations with the United States. The United States is our most important ally. And although the Secretary of State has changed in the course of today, Rex Tillerson said recently we stand in solidarity with our allies in the UK, and that what happened in Salisbury was a really egregious act, and he was extremely concerned by Russia becoming more aggressive. There's no reason to believe that the policy of the American administration will change with a new Secretary of State. Does it not, therefore, be incumbent upon all senior Labour politicians to have the closest regard to our interests with the United States and our diplomatic relations with them, and to stop the puerile name-calling of the President and others in his administration with whom they happen to have political disagreements? It's the interest of Britain which should be first and foremost.
Well, I have to say that I do not approve of the methods of the President of the US and the way he communicates. I think it is the office of the presidency of the United States of America is one that should command respect even amongst those who did not vote for the current president, and I'm not sure the current president is in that situation. I am troubled at the fact that Rex Tillerson, as the Secretary of State, was supportive of the UK and was wholly supportive of the Prime Minister's position, and he has been sacked as a result of it. Now, that does trouble me. What does that mean in terms of what support will come from the US government for the position of the UK government in terms of this horrific attack? And there are many questions that are asked as a result of that. I have never taken the view that we should in some way cut off our ties with the US. I was there a fortnight ago and spent time both in the US and in Canada. My view is that we should reach out to all democratic nations and entities, including the European Union, of course an entity which he is less keen to keep ties with.
Arweinydd Plaid Cymru.
Leader of Plaid Cymru, Leanne Wood.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, can you outline the role of Assembly members, the role that we have in terms of scrutiny of the South Wales Metro Plan and the next rail franchise?
Well, it's open up to members, of course, to scrutinise the government's plans in the normal way.
Well, the comparison of the South Wales Metro to the Loch Ness Monster by one of your backbenchers sums up how many of us feel about it. Your government won't explain what's going on and people want clarity. You won't even publish the invitation to tender document, and that's something that's been done by every other country that makes up the UK. And it's now been confirmed that Transport for Wales believes that the electrification of the Ebbw Vale line has been, and I quote, discontinued from further consideration. Can you confirm that you no longer have any intention to electrify the Ebbw Vale line by 2023?
Well, the Ebbw Vale line was not included in the original spec for electrification. That does not mean, of course, that there won't be more frequent services on the line. That will happen. Now, when it comes to the Metro itself, as I'm sure members are sick of me saying, the Metro was something that I first mooted many years ago in, of all places, Bedwas Rugby Club. There is a map that's been published, including different phases of how the Metro will be developed. It's not simply a question of upgrading what is already there. It does mean looking at, for example, new light rail links, particularly where there are existing heavy rail lines that are not in use. It does mean looking at the way buses interact with both light rail and heavy rail. And we've shown our commitment, of course, by making sure that we have control of the track itself, to make sure that we're not in the hands of Network Rail, over whom we have no powers to direct. We fully intend to move forward, and we've allocated money for this purpose, with better trains, more convenient trains, a reasonable price, an integrated network, and, of course, more frequent trains. And that's exactly what the Metro will deliver.
This sounds to me very much like a reverse gear, First Minister. Your original business case included the Ebbw Vale line. It said, and I quote, "The case for electrification of the Valleys Line rail network is first and foremost on the basis that all lines are included from Ebbw Vale to Maesteg and with the Vale of Glamorgan line included." Now, the documents published by Transport for Wales are based on the latest available information, which was published in November 2017, 2 months after the final invitation to tender. So I ask you, First Minister, what information did Transport for Wales receive which led to them stating that the Ebbw Vale line, the Maesteg line and the Vale of Glamorgan schemes have been discontinued?
Well, they've been discontinued because there will be more frequent services on those lines, as we've said. For example, we look at Maesteg, for example, Well, if you look at my stake, for example, I mean, if you want to ask me about trains, then good luck. If you look at my stake, for example, a twice-hourly service is what is being proposed. Whether that means through to Cardiff, or what that means one to Bridgend, one to Cardiff. Of course, the problem with my stake is, of course, that the main line electrification has gone west of Cardiff. Now, that adds significantly to the cost of electrifying to my stake. Originally, when we looked at the metro plans, the UK government had said it would electrify Swansea. Now that has disappeared. But let's be quite clear about this. Two things to emphasise here. Firstly, whatever is the method of traction, there will be a better service and a more frequent service. And secondly, to suggest, as suggested last week, that you can divorce Cardiff from the rest of the Valley lines, clearly doesn't work. Many people come to work in Cardiff from the valleys. That means when they get to Cardiff, it's hugely important they can get around Cardiff properly and get around Cardiff in the easiest way possible. And that means, of course, integrating the system in Cardiff compared to with those of the valley lines. Again, let me be absolutely clear. There will be more frequent services. There will be better services. Some lines will be electrified first. The business case for others we looked at in the future. We can't electrify them all at once. We're looking at the lines and developing electrification as time goes on. But the point Plaid Cymru is trying to make is this: that somehow there's been, and I know they're not listening, somehow there has been a move away from providing people in the South Wales metro area with a better train service. That's not the case. The trains will be better, more frequent. In the first phases, some will be electrified. There will be a rolling programme of doing that. People will be able to catch buses that connect with train services. They will be part of an integrated network in a way that's never been possible before. The metro will happen. It will move forward along the lines we've suggested, along the plans that we've suggested, and the people in the South Wales metro area will get a better service.
Question 3, Mark.
Question 3, Mark Isherwood.
What assessment has the Welsh Government made of the economic benefit that heritage railways bring to Wales?
Well, we fully recognise the economic value of all our heritage railways, and we've helped support the extension and development of a number of heritage railways across Wales.
Thank you. Well, writing in last November's edition of the Heritage Railway magazine, its editor, Robin Jones, referred to the Llangollen Railway big push into Corwen Central, as well as to the Bala Lake Railway extension, highlighting the multiple economic benefits to local councils and others that heritage railways can guarantee. What action will you therefore take to ensure better understanding at all levels of government and business activity of the benefit that heritage railways, such as Llangollen Railway, can bring to the areas they serve?
I couldn't quite hear most of the question. You mentioned the Llangollen Railway, I think, at the end. Well, the Llangollen Railway is hugely important, not just in terms of the tourist attraction that's there, but also as a mode of transport, but the apprenticeships that I saw when I was there. They're a maintenance operation for a number of other heritage railways as well. And they, of course, are able to provide employment opportunities. We often think of heritage railways as employing mainly volunteers. That's no longer the case, particularly what I saw in Llangollen. We know that heritage railways are an enormous tourist attraction, marketed, of course, at one time as the Great Little Trains of Wales. Well, Llangollen is a standard gauge line as opposed to a narrow gauge line. We know, of course, that the Snowdon Mountain Line is hugely important and a massive tourist attraction there. We see, of course, the link between the Festiniog Railway and the Welsh Highland Railway and the way that's been done. So, from our perspective, we have funded heritage railways in the past. For example, the Welsh Highland Railways had 420,000, Snowdon 300,000, the Llanberis Lake Railway 400,000 for a line extension. So we do understand how important heritage railways are, and we'll look to support them in the future.
Question 4, Sian.
Question 4, Sian Gwynllian. Will the First Minister make a statement on the White Paper on local government reform?
Well, as I said when the member asked a similar question last week, the approach to strengthening local government is under consideration, and the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government and Public Services will make a statement on the way forward in due course.
You mentioned that I'd asked this question last week when I asked about the U-turn that your government has made. Well, you said that the situation hasn't changed on the way forward. This suggested to me that you weren't aware of the recent statements made by your Cabinet Secretary, Alan Davies, and this is shocking to me and suggests to me, one, that you're not taking a great deal of interest in local government, which is the net that safeguards our most vulnerable people, and two, that there hadn't been any discussion within your cabinet on the current change of direction. So can you enlighten us a little further than you've done already on the direction of travel for you as a government?
Well, as a former councillor before I came to this place, I know how important local government is and the work that members carry out locally to represent their communities. But may I say one thing that hasn't changed is that the status quo cannot continue, and secondly, it's vital to ensure that regional collaboration still happens. It will make a huge difference in education, or to education, where we've seen learners improving very much over the past years. But there is an argument, of course, to be had as regards what the formula should be in the future. We can't stand still, so we must think what is the best direction forward. And of course, it's open to members to give their views on that.
First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government has said that local democracy is all about participation. The usual pearls of wisdom we've come to expect from my friend Alan Davies. Alan Davies has also said that he wants councils to pilot innovative ways of voting which reflects people's busy lives, something which I would certainly agree with in principle. Of course, in practice, when you alter voting systems, it does open up the possibility of greater fraud. So how are you going to make sure that the new system of local government elections that follows on from these reforms doesn't open the door on a greater amount of fraud that we can't keep track on in the same way we can with the current voting patterns?
I think on the issue of electronic voting, the issue of security is an important one. We don't have a situation in this country where people have to produce ID when they vote, and I hope that never has to happen in the future. So when it comes to postal votes and when it comes to people voting in person, I think we have as robust a system as we can get. Now, in principle, I favour the idea of electronic voting, but I'm not convinced that the security yet exists to make sure that that system is robust, and I think that's where we need to go. So I wouldn't object to electronic voting in the future, but I think the public would need to be reassured, especially in the present day, that there will be no prospect of systems being hacked, or indeed any prospect of somebody impersonating another voter. And that, I think, is where the work needs to be done over the next few years.
David Rees.
First Minister, as you've just identified, local government reform is under consultation at this point in time, or will be under consultation. But the boundary changes for ABMU were premised upon one local authority saying they wanted to change so suit their services better. Do you think it's now wise to actually go ahead with any changes with that boundary change whilst we await the consideration of reform for local authority, and therefore should it actually now be put on hold whilst the local authority reform is considered?
Well, I mean, the consultation has ended. We will look, of course, at the responses to that consultation, and that will form part of our thinking in terms of local government.
Vicky Howells.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, I'm sure that one thing that every AM in this chamber would agree on is the need to increase people's engagement in the democratic process and increase turnout at elections. And I know that one idea that's being considered as part of the Welsh Government's package of reforms is electronic voting. In framing my supplementary today, I wanted to cite an example where electronic voting had improved turnout, but actually looking at the experiences of Norway and Estonia, electronic voting actually had little effect in increasing participation. Instead, it was noted that we need to emphasise why voting is important. What are the First Minister's reflections on this evidence, and how best can we highlight the reasons why political participation is so crucial?
Yes, it's difficult to know, without looking fully at the evidence, why that situation occurred in Norway and Estonia. I think what's important is to offer people as many methods of voting as is reasonable, to give them as much chance as possible to vote. We have historically in this country voted on Thursday, not always, as the member for Ireland Deeside knows. But, for example, other countries vote on the weekend. The reason why we never had votes on a Sunday is my grandfather wouldn't have voted on Sunday, bluntly. Sabbatarianism. I'm not sure we're in a similar position to that now. So I think we do need to look at whether weekend voting is the way forward. Of course, there are some people who are working on a Saturday or Sunday, but flexibility there, electronic voting, postal voting. It's important, I think, that we look at as many means as possible of enabling people to vote as long as those means are secure.
Question 5,
Question 5, Julie Morgan.
Does the Welsh Government have to improve access to women's health services?
Well, we expect Welsh Health Boards to provide a full range of safe and sustainable health services to women, taking account of NICE guidance and waiting time targets.
Thank you for that response. More than 3 out of 4 abortions in Wales, nearly 80%, are medical rather than surgical procedures, which involve taking 2 doses of tablets within 72 hours of each other. Currently in Wales, both of these tablets have to be taken in a clinic, whereas in Scotland, women are now allowed to take the 2nd dose of misoprostol at home. Would the First Minister agree that women in Wales would be better off if they could take this 2nd dose at home, avoiding unnecessary medical appointments and also the risks of travelling often on public transport after taking the 2nd dose?
Well, I can inform my friend the member for Cardiff North that clinicians have approached the Welsh Government about this issue. We are considering the evidence, in particular, of course, about the possibility for more efficient service and, of course, safer, improved outcomes for women before committing to any future plans. She is right to point to what is happening in Scotland. There is a judicial review, however, in Scotland that is ongoing that challenges that policy. Obviously, we're taking an interest in that. So what I can say to her is that we're looking at the Scottish situation, looking to see in terms of safety whether that should apply to Wales, and of course looking to make sure that the judicial review, looking to see what the outcome of the judicial review actually is.
Angela Burns.
Presiding Officer. First Minister, over the last decade, approximately 70% of women who've been called forward to have breast test screenings have actually taken forward that invitation and have had the screenings that have sometimes saved their lives. However, there is a hardcore 30% that we are unable to reach to persuade them of the benefit of taking up this kind of screening. Do you think it would be an appropriate time now, after a decade, that we actually conduct some kind of survey to try to understand what the barriers are to that 30% accessing what could be potentially a life-saving screening service, and how we can then address their concerns so that we can have a better uptake for this very vital element of women's health?
I think the member makes a perfectly sensible suggestion, and one which needs to inform the work that we are doing with public health teams, health boards and primary care clusters to improve the screening uptake. She is quite correct in the figures that she quotes. More worryingly, Breast Test Wales have observed a gradual decline in uptake since 2007, which is a worrying, not quite a long-term trend, but enough for it to be concerning in terms of a trend over the past 9 years. More than 110,000 tests are conducted as part of the programme. There need to be more, and examining why women don't take the opportunity of going through screening has to be an important part of making sure we go past that 70% figure.
Question 6.
Question 6, Janet Finn-Saunders.
Will the First Minister make a statement on the future roles of community and town councils in Wales?
Well, an independent review is looking at the future role of community and town councils and what needs to be in place to enable them to play that role, and it will be reporting later this year.
Over the past 7 years, I've had many concerns raised with me regarding the functions of community town councils, and in that time, also I've raised them here, but there's been 2 other reviews, so we're now finding ourselves in the middle of a review going forward. Now, the Wales Audit Office has found 65 community councils have not even yet adopted a code of conduct for members, 99 unable to provide evidence that they maintain and publish a register of interests, 81 failed to comply with statutory timetable for publishing audited accounts, 260 submitted annual returns that were incomplete or contained simple errors, and 108 do not have a website and have not made other arrangements to publish information. And we know that 81% of town and community council seats last year were uncontested or vacant. Now, I and many others consider community councils to be a very important level in our 5 layers currently of democratic governance. How can we be assured, First Minister, that you will actually show some, sort of involvement in this, and that this review will actually deliver a new way of moving forward for our community councils, so that our residents, our community councillors can be assured that all those relevant processes are in place in terms of transparency, democratic accountability and financial probity?
Well, as somebody who was once a community councillor some time ago, I know how important community councils are. I think there are several issues there that the member raises which will need to be looked at as part of the process. First of all, we have a lot of community councils. There are 700 of them. They vary wildly in size. Some represent barely more than 100 people. Others, many thousands of people. I don't think it's realistic for us to expect the same of all of them, given their differences in size. For example, Barry Town Council, compared to Merthyr Mawr Community Council in my part of the world, there's an enormous difference in size. And there are some parts of Wales, the Rhondda, for example, where there are no community councils at all. So, as part of the review, I think it's hugely important to look at numbers, to look at capacity, to look at how we can give more powers to town and community councils. It may be asymmetric because of their size, the size difference, and how we can empower them in the future. All that is forming part of the review that's moving forward. I think I'm right in saying there's one, and the member for Monmouth will enlighten me on this. There is one, I think, community council in Monmouthshire where literally 1 in 8 of the population have to be on the council in order for the council to have a full quota of members. That's what I've been told. Well, you know, in those circumstances, it is hugely difficult to have a situation where all seats are contested. And it's right to say that in a vigorous democracy, not necessarily on party political grounds, but in a vigorous democracy, we want as many people to stand for community councils as possible.
Mick Antonin.
Well, First Minister, in Taffeli and Pontypridd, of course, we have 6 very well-run, exemplary community councils who've put forward this submission towards the consultations underway. That's Llantrisant, Llantwit-Vardra, Pontyclun, Pontypridd, Taftswell and Nantgow and Tonarefel. And they put forward a number of recommendations in terms of how they see the role of community councils development. And I'll only ask you about one of those, because one of the things they suggest is that well-run town and community councils could well be a very effective facilitator for local heritage, sport and cultural projects. Do you think this is an area that we should be examining with regard to community councils, endorsing, supporting and upholding the local community, the local heritage, where they have real grassroots knowledge?
Well, absolutely. I think active and activist community and town councils are a hugely important part of our democracy. And local knowledge can't be underestimated. I mean, for example, when I was a community councillor, we had people on there with an encyclopedic knowledge of the local footpaths. And we were responsible for them, and they were maintained as a result of that. And that was very well felt in the community, because they could see the footpaths being maintained. So it is important to see what we can do. First of all, to have consistency in terms of the sustainability of community and town councils, and then look to see what powers they can be given, as I said, because there are bound to be big differences in size, to see what powers are appropriate for whatever size of community or town council there might be.
Question 7, James.
Question 7, Jane Bryan.
First Minister, give an update on Maternity Network Wales.
Well, since its launch in 2015, the Maternity Network has brought together health professionals to work on 3 priority areas: reducing stillbirth, improving the quality and safety of services, and working in partnership with women and their families. And there are plans this year to align this network with a neonatal network.
Thank you, First Minister. Stillbirth can have a devastating and long-lasting impact on families. The Safer Pregnancy campaign launched by Maternity Network in March last year has sought to reduce the risk of stillbirth. A study conducted by Emma Mills of St Woolas Hospital's Clinical Research and Innovation Centre found that interventional care led to a marked decrease in stillbirth rates. Emma was instrumental in bringing the study to Gwent, and stillbirth rates dropped between 25% and 50% in the first year. The stillbirth rate in the Nairn Bevan Health Board last year was 4.3 per 1,000 births, notably lower than a national average of 5.8. Can the First Minister commend the work by Emma Mills and ensure that this work is disseminated to all health boards across Wales? And can he join with me in praising the excellent support provided by midwives and volunteers such as SANS, who help families from the early hours after a baby's death through to the weeks, months and years ahead?
Well, we know the causes of stillbirth are multifaceted, with some factors still not clearly understood, so the work done by Emma Mills and others is vital if we're going to achieve a significant reduction in stillbirths. There is collaborative work involving the Maternity Network, SANS and maternity services across Wales, and that has resulted in a range of interventions being taken forward. Early indications do show a reduction in the numbers of stillbirths. Early signs yet, but they seem to give us a picture that is improving. One thing I think is important as well is it's important that people who experience the effects of a stillbirth, to have bereavement support services available to them. I've seen this, with my own eyes, where people do feel that they have lost somebody. They do not see it in terms of a stillbirth, they see it in terms of a child. And hugely important then that bereavement services are available. It is now part of the core part of maternity services in Wales, and that is something I think it's hugely important for those who suffer so much as a result of experiencing stillbirth.
Mark Reckless.
Is it right for women so often to be guided to midwife-led birthing units as a default option rather than to consultant-led labour wards?
Well, the women around me on the front bench have all said yes to that. That they're more than happy to be in the hands of a midwife. And midwives, of course, are fully qualified to deal with the vast majority of births. Where there are occasions when births are more difficult, then of course mothers are usually planned. Actually, this is usually planned. Mothers are taken to maternity units that have more specialised services, but midwives provide us with a fantastic service.
Question 8, John.
Question 8, John Griffiths.
What further steps will the Welsh Government take towards a more preventative approach to ill health in Wales?
Well, prevention will continue to be central to our approach for improving and protecting population health. What does that mean? Well, looking at programmes such as smoking cessation, immunisation programmes and healthy schools and workplace programmes.
First Minister, a few weeks ago, Sophie Howers, Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales, gave evidence in facing scrutiny to the committee I chair, the Equalities, Local Government and Communities Committee. She mentioned that she's proposing to Welsh Government that new money for health should be earmarked for the preventative agenda and subject to joint work between health and non-health bodies in an attempt to get the health service in Wales onto a more preventative and proactive footing in accordance with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. There seems to be a consensus that we do need to get onto the front foot in preventing ill health, in also, of course, meeting day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month health pressures that people rightly expect to be met. Would you support that proposal to use new monies in that way?
I don't think we can use all new money that way because, of course, there are pressures elsewhere in the NHS. Sensibly, of course, I don't disagree with what he's saying. Prevention is, as they say, is better than cure, but we do also have to deal with the pressures that are put on the NHS, particularly pressures in acute services, and look to fund them. That said, £88 million has been allocated in this financial, the last financial year rather, to Public Health Wales to provide, this financial year, I beg your pardon, provide a range of measures aimed at preventing ill health. That means smoking cessation. We know that smoking is a significant factor in ill health, particularly as people get older. And quite often where people stop smoking, the effects are still there. It depends how long they've been smoking and on them as individuals. Screening, we've already mentioned screening in the chamber, how important screening is to prevent and detect the early stages of serious illnesses. Vaccination, childhood immunisation, that's hugely important. And also active travel, being able to give people the easiest opportunities to be able to walk, to be able to cycle, and it's good to see authorities such, if I can put in just a plug for Bridgend here, investing in cycle routes to make sure that people are able to cycle from the town centre in Bridgend all the way up the Ogmore Valley and the Gowrie Valley on the cycle routes that exist there without ever having to go on a busy road. And being able to encourage people to be active and to maintain that habit of being active is hugely important in terms of prevention. And I know with him I'm preaching to the converted.
Finally, Mohammed Ashkar.
First Minister, the number of people living with diabetes in Wales has almost doubled in the last 10 years. Gwent has the highest prevalence in Wales, with research showing that 8% of the population of Naibevan Health Board area is living with diabetes. Can the First Minister confirm that the National Obesity Strategy covers both prevention and treatment, and will he commit his government to particularly targeting funds at diabetes hotspots such as South Wales East?
Well, the member will know, of course, that the Public Health Wales Act does give clear legislative focus to action to address the priority public health issue of obesity. which of course is such a cause of type 1 diabetes. The obesity strategy will, type 2 diabetes I think, I'm right in saying, I'll be corrected by the medics in the chamber. Our obesity strategy, or indeed fellow lawyers, our obesity strategy will bring together all the work the Welsh Government supports to tackle what is a major public health challenge and put it on a statutory footing. A strategy development board chaired by the Chief Medical Officer is overseeing delivery, and a consultation will be launched in the early summer.
Thank you, First Minister. The next item is the business statement and announcement.